I had Sebastian Younger on here not that long ago talking about his own extraordinary experience of a near-death experience. These are real things. And I think it's important you also talk about this. There are that these things that we think of as weird, and ghosts and things. Actually, we do have lots of empirical, old-school, scientific understanding that certain things happen in the world that we do not have any way of explaining.
And the materialists hate to confront that. So that it's a strange feeling, which I've had before, but where you're writing passages and you say, there are people who I admire and whose good opinion I want who are going to be very disappointed in me saying this. And one of these chapters is challenges to materialism. And so I take on near-death experiences. Now, a couple of points I think that many of the listeners may not be aware of. Most of them have heard of near-death experiences. These are not a few New Age people recounting mystical visions of the tunnel and the loving entity at the end of it. There are literally thousands of well-documented cases. Patterns have been examined. There are lots of very serious scientists who have looked at all this. And out of this welter of evidence, much of which cannot be independently verified, is a core of really weird stuff if you're trying to say that consciousness exists only in the brain. For example, when you have people who are clinically dead, no heartbeat, no respiration, no brainwaves, and they can remember when they come back conversations between the surgeon and the nurse. They can remember that a nurse took his dentures and put them in a particular drawer. They can remember a surgeon making weird gestures with his arms, like he was flapping his arms, and it turns out that's what he was doing when his hands were sterile and he couldn't point. He had to use his elbows to point to things. These are just a few of lots of very well-documented cases where things have been observed by people who had no consciousness as we ordinarily understand it to observe them.
And in this particular case, what's interesting is science and medical technology has, of course, dramatically increased the possibility of almost dying and then coming back, because we have ability. So we now know more about this than anybody else previously did. And in those contexts, when you're all in a bloody hospital somewhere, you're surrounded by people who are rigorous scientists who are looking at things empirically. You have data you can show and evidence that's real, that there's not some strange story, but is something that you can document that has no explanation. Some of these people knew about stuff that was happening 2 doors down from them.
Yes.
There were things they saw in other parts of the hospital they were in, and there was no way they could not have done that. And I think people who have been around people at the hour of our death, as we Catholics put it, are also aware of something very, very different and strange.
Terminal lucidity.
Yes.
Terminal lucidity is not nearly as well known in the general public as near-death experiences. But if you talk to people who work in hospices, chances are that there will be a staff member there who has witnessed this. It goes like this. You have somebody with advanced dementia, have not recognized spouse or children for years, have not said a comprehensible word for years. The medical evidence for that dementia is undeniable, and a day or so before they die, suddenly they are back, maybe for 10 minutes, maybe for an hour. Back meaning they recognize spouse and children. They have memories that they talk about. Their personality characteristics are back. Where does that come from? Because their brains, with dementia, with certain kinds of strokes, with meningitis, and there are conditions in which neuroscience, as far as we know, says their brains are not capable of organized thoughts, and they have organized thoughts. Well, it's an example of a broader phenomenon, Andrew, that I think people need to recognize. The relationship of science to religion has shifted hugely in the last 30, 40 years. For centuries, you had the God of the gaps. So religion took the things it did not know how to explain and assigned them to God. And science explained thunderstorms, it explained earthquakes, it explained all this other stuff. The last 40, 50 years, science has been coming up with new puzzles that we never thought of before, that science not only cannot explain, but it's very difficult to see where the possibility of an explanation is.
And NDEs is one of those things, terminal lucidity and other things. In other words, that we had this sort of 19th century narrative that science and history, these disciplines, would essentially replace faith. They were going to demystify it. And yet, oddly, and you make this point in the book, that science itself, in trying to grapple with the idea of where this universe came from, actually came up in the early 20th century with the Big Bang. And I think it's important for people to also remember that the Big Bang is a term of abuse. It was a term to ridicule this idea the whole place started with the Big Bang. But in fact, science has the 20th century and now the 21st is where we've discovered that this is really happening and how it happened. And so science has expanded. Actually, it's one of these weirdest things that science actually has come back and told us, well, you know what, that story in Genesis, not that off. I mean, yes, it's a metaphor, but it did start from nothing. And whatever began it outside of time and space.